Okay, great. So welcome everyone to our weekly conversation on the future of work and well-being. If possible, turn on your cameras. It's just nice to see everyone. And I just like to start by thanking the organizers. So that will be Andrew Kuhn, Linda Boyle, Raffaella Sadun, John Lee, Manfred Tscheligi, and myself, and to acknowledge the support from the National Science Foundation that partially funding this series. So as usual, the first part will be recorded. We would love to have questions from the audience, and Andrew will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, put them in the chat and Andrew will call at you at some point to ask your question. And stay with us for the second part. So after about 30 minutes, we will turn off the recording and we will have a more informal conversation. Imagine that we're all kind of standing around a table with some food and chatting after the presentation, but that's kind of the vibe that we're trying to create. Okay, so with that, I am delighted to welcome Calvin Liang, who is a PhD student at the Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. He is co-advised by Dr. Sean Monson and Dr. Julie Kins. And Calvin received his master's from Tufts University, and he is an alum of our International Research Exchange Program between the US and Germany, where we spent some time at Albert Schmidt Lab, which was the last year of Stuttgart. So you might have met in our different European activities that summer. So Calvin, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. And the conversation today is about the future of well-being is queer. So I want to kind of ask, can you give us some example of how you work with LGBTQ people to design new technologies for well-being?
Yeah, so I think two projects kind of come to mind. The first one being this project we partnered with Seattle Children's Research Institute to design an online sex education resource for trans and gender diverse youth. And kind of the motivation for that was very much like, you know, sex education generally is pretty bad in the US, but it's especially, you know, exclusionary and honestly like harmful for people who don't have like a normative sexual and romantic experience. And so we were really motivated to work together with gender diverse youth to develop some sort of online tool. And so, yeah, it was like this very participatory design, co-design kind of esque study, and learned a lot about, you know, what their preferences are in terms of like what their design needs and like what content needs they are looking for. Yeah, and learned a lot about, I guess, the needs of sex education for trans youth today. Yeah, and then the second project that comes to mind is wrote this paper on socio-technical design for HIV. And what we did is we looked at 49 dating apps, or intimate platforms we call them, and assessed which ones kind of account for HIV in their design. And we found that 13 of the 49, you know, even mention at the very least HIV. And all 13 of those were apps meant for queer men. And so our analysis kind of takes on like an individual level, community level, and structural level approach, in that, you know, on the individual level, right, like designing for HIV, you know, the literature says that it can be both really beneficial to users living with HIV, but it also can be a discriminatory like tool for people to, you know, filter out people with HIV. And so, you know, this kind of, it's a complicated design feature that kind of contributes to stigma and discrimination, but it's also like helpful to some users. And then on this community level, it kind of gets at the stigma and stuff. But oh, and then the fact that like only the queer, or, you know, queer men apps that accounted for HIV, this kind of, we point out that it reinforces a false narrative that like only queer men have to deal with HIV, when like this is something that everyone has to think about. And like really, we're really trying to challenge the platform's responsibility in their role in like hookup and dating culture. And so like asking these platforms to be a little bit more proactive in terms of how they're protecting their users. But then the kind of higher level, structural level that was really exciting is like we also looked at which dating apps had policies in place that protected their users from their users' data from being sold to third parties. And this is like something that happens, unfortunately. Like Grindr got in a lot of trouble because they were like selling their users' data to someone or a company, not an individual. But you know, and so we look at kind of this higher level data security and surveillance perspective, just to point out that like, you know, I think in HCI, we really love thinking about design and design features, but to kind of understand the broader implications of like, and really ask like, is it possible to design for HIV in a way that doesn't leave users susceptible to state surveillance? And yeah, those are like kind of the two main projects in mind.
I'm kind of fascinated. Is it possible to design, or like what are ways to design in a way that doesn't expose users to surveillance?
Well, so I think to pair kind of the design features that allow for HIV disclosure and the mediation of or communication of HIV status with potential partners with like policies in place that protect that data, I think is a good first step. Of course, like it's not perfect, and so we kind of we took inspiration from, I think, existing what we kind of defined as like queer approaches, which involve like, you know, not not kind of disclosing your status through the platform's disclosure fields, but like kind of doing it on your own accord and like kind of in private messages. There's also like some apps kind of got creative, and when presenting HIV disclosure options, I think they only provided two, and I forget the exact wording, but it was done in a way that like it kind of, if someone was disclosing their HIV status, it was kind of conspicuous in a way that I think wouldn't kind of label them in a potentially dangerous way.
Good, good. So I'd like to hear more, but I kind of want to take a step back to think about lens to look at this research. And the step back that I want to take is to think more generally about kind of marginalized users and research with marginalized users in human-computer interaction. And I know that you have an upcoming Tokai, kind of a journal paper, that look at practices and tensions of HCI research with marginalized users. So first, congratulations. And second, can you tell us more about your work and what are tensions that you recognized?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was like oh my gosh, this is such a big like paper to take on, and really turned into this bigger project than we ever expected. And so, you know, the motivation was, maybe I'll kind of step back and tell the like origin story of this paper. And so I had this experience where I talked to a researcher who, you know, had made their career working with disabled users and kind of providing or developing assistive technologies. And they're kind of reflecting on that, and had kind of shared that they were thinking about not doing that research anymore because they felt bad as an able-bodied person doing research on people with disabilities. And I thought this was a really, I like took away from that conversation a really interesting, it's just like, this is interesting because like I understand the kind of intent with this like choice to move back, but at the same time, it felt like kind of a waste of power and privilege, right? Like to kind of be in a position of power and kind of give that up kind of seemed, I don't know, I didn't think that was maybe the best move. And so, you know, brought these larger questions of like, can an able-bodied researcher do research with people with disabilities, and can what is the line between doing research with marginalized people with your own identities? And so it kind of ballooned into this ginormous paper. But we interviewed, I think, 24 HCI researchers who had experience working with marginalized people, and kind of identified 4 tensions: their exploitation, disclosure, membership, and allyship. And so I can go through each one, and I can talk about this for forever. But with exploitation, oh, and I'll take a step back. So we also looked at each level, or each tension from like the participant level, so like how researchers are interacting with participants, and then another level where researchers are interacting with other researchers, and then this final level of like how the field of HCI kind of imposes its norms onto researchers, and how that in turn kind of trickles down into how researchers treat participants. And so kind of returning to those 4 tensions, exploitation, participants in our study talked about how they felt like they were getting, there was this uneven give and take in the research process, in that like the researchers were receiving so much compared to what the participants were getting out of the research. And they felt like this was this extractive, exploitative process, but at the same time, there's really nothing they felt like they could do about that, because it just was inherent to the research process. And then kind of on the other side of that, in terms of how we treat other researchers, the idea of tokenization got brought up. And I think in work with marginalized people, in work with marginalized people on a research team where you don't have any representative identities, excuse me, let me take some water. So if you're on a research team and you're working with a group of marginalized people, and if you don't have anyone on your team who has, shared identity or experience with participants, like it often is a good idea to, or a well-intentioned idea to bring on a research member who does. And so participants in our study kind of talked about how this leaves them in a really like kind of awkward position, because like they don't love the idea of feeling, or of being tokenized for their experiences of marginalization, but at the same time they felt like there was no other, they had no other choice but to accept this like offer in order to make sure that this work is done with care. And so it kind of is exploitation on these 2 different levels, which is, and they're very hard to navigate. And then the next one is membership. And so in this one, we ultimately like problematize the idea that people with marginalized identities can do no harm, and people without those identities can only do harm. It's like this kind of binary thinking we try and like really unpack. But it's complicated, because like when you do have shared identity or experience, which we've referred to as membership, it is this really helpful thing, right? Like I've experienced this in my own work, right? It's helpful to have that shared connection, but at the same time, it doesn't guarantee that, it's not this fail-safe, right? It doesn't guarantee that you're going to be doing this work well just because you have some sort of connection with your participants. And so in this tension, we really try to challenge like kind of what I see as an emerging idea that like we should be gatekeeping work on marginalized people based on a researcher's identity. And like we talk about how this is actually like re-marginalizing researchers, because it's mostly because it kind of pigeonholes marginalized researchers into doing research for their own groups, right? And it's a, this kind of means like if you want work done on queer populations, you have to go do it yourself. And like that, I think, can be kind of burdensome to some researchers, because it kind of doesn't really leave them open to exploring other options. And then of course, like if we're thinking about membership and requiring membership and identity to do this kind of work, like the kind of natural question is like, how do you find that out? Like, how do you, like, we can't ask researchers to kind of out themselves and their identities in order to make their work seem valid. And so this kind of leads to the tension of disclosure, where we talk about, reflexivity and positionality statements, and those are really having a moment right now in HCI, and for good reasons, right? Like, they work to communicate bias to the audience, and they're really helpful. But at the same time, like, requiring these kinds of statements or pushing for this to be more of a norm has some serious like consequences that I think we need to like really take a step back and consider, because not everyone has the freedom to disclose their identities as freely as other people. And so yeah, and we kind of talk about that in the tension of disclosure. And then the last one is allyship. It's quite complicated, but I think I wrote the line like, not all research that claims to be allyship is allyship, and at the same time, like, all research should be allyship. And it's this like really paradoxical way of thinking. Perhaps another way of thinking about it is like, we should all be like trying to incorporate allyship and social justice into our work, but as soon as we kind of say that we're being allies or our work is allyship, like, that negates everything, right? Like, you're no longer really being an ally when you are obsessed with the identification of that. And so it's this weird balance of like incorporating it into your values while also not prioritizing your own kind of agenda or values. And so yeah, I think with those four tensions, we kind of lay out kind of what's difficult about them, but also ways that researchers can think about these, each of them, and kind of discuss and really figure out how to move forward in the best way. And the last thing I'll say is, it was really important that we presented this not as like a checklist, right? Like, because I think this kind of work isn't a perfect science. You can't, unfortunately, you can't like just check all the boxes and then you're like perfectly, you're doing research with marginalized people perfectly well. It's like a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. And so yeah, really emphasizing that this process, yeah, and ongoing work.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is such an important kind of, the way I look at it is set of lens to look at research and to think about research, and perhaps even to identify trade-offs. As you said, it's there are no right answers here, but this is an important set of questions and tensions to consider. So let's go back to your work with gender diverse youth, for example, or with HIV users, and think, how do you mitigate these tensions in your own work?
Yeah, so I will say that, as we were doing that project, these tensions were still being formed. And so I can't really talk about how like we were thinking about it at the time, but I can provide kind of a retrospective, look back. And so yeah, with exploitation, right? Like, I think we were very conscious of like, or we were very intentional about how do we make this experience for the participants, like, knowing that we can't have this equal give and take. Like, how can we maybe move the needle so that it's not completely extractive, and so we can kind of provide a bit more in addition to the monetary compensation that we kind of commonly do in research. And so I would say that so this one experience kind of stands out in my mind. And so like we were doing this series of focus groups, and we had brought together a group of gender diverse youth ages 14 to 24, I think. And so like at the end of this focus group, we were all packing up and stuff, and we like look over to like where all the food is, and like this ginormous, like all of our participants are just like sitting on the floor, like huddled together and just like chatting. And, like, walk over and see what's happening, and they're like sharing like contact information, and they're like laughing, and they're just like connecting. And you know, like they had said that they had never really been in a room of other gender diverse youth before, and it was like really wonderful to get together and like, I don't know, connect and find community. And like, I'll be honest, this is not something we anticipated at all. And like, you know, looking back, I am really glad that this happened, and kind of maybe wish we would have kind of thought about this a bit more ahead of time. But it was this moment where I was like, oh, I think that like this means more than just like a strict like researcher participant kind of relationship, right? It felt more meaningful. Maybe with membership, right? Like you know, as someone who has shared experience in membership with these youth, like felt like that could be something that I could use to my advantage, and like really help establish better trust with participants. But at the same time, I was like deeply aware of how our experiences were different. And so that made me kind of, I'm not gonna lie, like really self-conscious and like really unsure of whether like I should even be the one doing this kind of work. And so it was definitely something that I had to work through, and the team had to work through, honestly. And, you know, thinking about like, what does it mean for us as a research team to be interacting with these kids, these youth, in a way that, you know, and we talk about sex ed, and so it's like, how do we bring our identities without kind of influencing them in negative ways? And so what's next? Oh, disclosure. So like, we didn't do any sort of disclosure statement in our work, and honestly, I think I do that differently now. But what we did do is really like communicate the kind of steps that we took to, you know, ensure that we were doing this work with care, right? And I think what's cool about the IDC conference, that's the conference it went to, they require this section on, I think it's called like ethics of child participation, something like that. And they require you to like document the steps that you've taken to ensure like the safety of your participants. And it, you know, it doesn't count to it's not a part of your word limit. And so it's nice to have that dedicated space. And we talk about how this could be a model for other conferences and journals. And then with allyship, right, like of course, like we weren't like actively thinking as we were doing this study, like we are being allies and like this is allyship happening. But I think we were very much like motivated to provide this thing for the youth that they needed and they wanted, right? Like they had indicated that they wanted. And so this was like very much the driving force, is like, we need to do this thing because it's what they want. And that, I think, to me, I think, you know, looking back, is like allyship was kind of the motivation, but it wasn't something that we were like, you know, that wasn't the end product. The end goal was like meaningfully engaging with these youth. Yeah.
Calvin, this is so interesting. Thank you. I wanted to start with some questions, and let me start with one question of my own, and that's, I was wondering if you could reflect on this idea. You brought up, you know, the bringing people onto the team for their experience in a particular community. And I'm wondering about, you know, that's one way of getting some experiences. And then there is the question of the team members themselves having a range of different experiences. And of course, they might not be, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, your sexual orientation might be one thing. So it's not clear that, you know, that's not necessarily the range of, but there might be other things, other types of experiences that might inform what you do. And so I'm kind of curious what you think about this. There are at least these two ways of getting interesting background, so to speak, onto the team. So what is your view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I think what you're highlighting here is this, you know, and we try to be careful about this in the paper, but kind of avoiding again this binary of like researchers who are marginalized and researchers who aren't, right? It's not as black and white as that. And like, you know, people experience a range of marginalization, and like, yeah, to say that someone is completely doesn't experience discrimination or whatever, I think is, I don't know, like a dangerous territory. But yeah, I totally see what you're saying. And I think really emphasizing that, again, this balance of like, how do you respect people's lived experiences and previous backgrounds, while also understanding that they don't, like, that experience doesn't grant them full authority over the experiences of your participants. And so I, you know, having a diverse team is like wonderful, and I think we should all be striving for that. And I think there are ways to like really build upon the like collective knowledge and experience in a way that also doesn't, or in a way that doesn't kind of go too far, right? It's like all about knowing limits, right? And being aware of the limits of what you can claim. And so I think you can say like, I have insight into this experience or my experience. That doesn't mean that I know everything, right, about what it means to work with queer people, for example. It just means like I have some sort of empathy, but like I'm going to go in with some curiosity while also being attentive to these things that like I myself am, you know, sure of because of my own experience. So it's all about that balance. Which is what makes it so hard, right? It's like an imperfect science, right? You can't, I don't know if there's ever a point where you know you're doing it perfectly right. And so really takes a lot of negotiation with your research team and with your participants, I think.
Thank you. Diana, did you want to get us started with questions?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to ask about specifically groups within marginalized communities. So I think when you say the word marginalized people, it's a really huge umbrella term for very specific groups. So my broad question is, how can we as researchers keep from treating marginalized people as a monolith? Because obviously, for example, a cis white gay man is going to be very different from a trans woman of color in that way. And I feel like we tend to lump these communities together like, oh, they're both queer, but are they? And I want to see what your thoughts on this are, or this extends to many marginalized communities, like people with disabilities or people with mental illnesses. They're so different within them. So any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think this is also, sorry, the trash truck is coming, so I hope you can hear that. But I think this points out probably the greatest limitation of this paper, which is like, we look at marginalization in such a broad sense that we definitely miss the kind of more localized, intricate like forms of oppression and how those play out specifically. And our hope is that people take this broader framework and kind of, you know, kind of develop more specific ways of thinking, you know, specific to different forms of marginalization. But and you know, there's existing work that's like really fantastic in HCI that's starting to do that. I think a really helpful framework for me to think through are the axes of oppression and the matrices of domination. And these are ideas that I guess I could share an image really quickly. But basically, the ideas are that like, it's really emphasizing that each individual experiences a range of oppression and privilege based on their identities. And like, there are several different axes of identities that kind of grant that privilege or oppression. And so each person kind of can place themselves somewhere along this axis. I think it would be helpful for me to provide this image though. So I
think you should be able to share.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, can I share? Where did it go? Sorry. It's weird. It's not showing up.
Andrew, did you make Kelvin a co-organizer?
Yeah, he should be.
Oh, sorry. I can share. It's just not giving me the right, or like the window I want to share isn't popping up. But I'll put it in the chat. Hopefully that helps. You know, it kind of demonstrates this like really wide range of experiences and identities that people can hold, and you know, really emphasizes that like, yes, you can face oppression in one sense of your life, but you can also gain like privilege in another. And so it provides a very complex, oh yeah, thank you, Andrew. It provides like a complex understanding of, and a holistic understanding of marginalization. And so really thinking with this framework in mind was really helpful in understanding that and avoiding monolithic thinking of marginalization, because it's just so complicated, right? Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I did not know about this matrix, so thank you.
Yeah.
Smriti, would you like to ask the next question, please?
Sure, sure. So, Kelvin, you mentioned that in your study, like researchers had to take extra care about the privacy of the participants. So, I'm actually working on suicide detection. So, I will be on the other side of the table, and I wanted your insight as to what all measures as researchers we should take so that the safety of the participants is also taken care of, and we as researchers also are able to get the data or address our research questions using interviews and all of that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it kind of depends on how you're defining safety. And, you know, if we're thinking about safety in terms of data security, right? Like, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong if that's not the case, but like, you know, really thinking about like what steps you can take kind of in addition to the existing structures that we have, right? Beyond the IRB structure that we have in the US. And yeah, I guess thinking about, and it's tough because it is kind of dependent on the groups that you're working with. And, you know, it's like, for example, you know, if I were working with queer people and like asking for HIV data, I think I would be really, really, really careful about how I handle that data and like making sure it's not linked to people's identities and participant IDs. But I don't know if I'm answering your question. I
am getting your essence, you're making sense, but it is very specific. I understand that. So for the ethics statement, for the ethics approval of your project, like how did you go about that? And was it difficult since you were dealing with a very sensitive area and you have to convince the ethics committee? So that is something which I'm concerned about.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I mean, with our work with the gender diverse youth, it's tricky, right? Like you're working with children or, you know, underage adults. No, that's not the right phrase, but, you know, youth. And, you know, beyond that, we're talking to trans youth and people who, you know, another marginalized group. And beyond that, we're talking about this really sensitive topic around sex education, right? And their relationship with sexual and romantic experiences. And so we had to be like very, very careful about how we planned on handling that. And so, you know, a lot of it came down to making sure this like research space that we were bringing them into was a safe and comfortable one. And I think that happens like in subtle ways, right? Like using people's pronouns and like, I don't know, making sure there are like gender neutral bathrooms or like bathrooms that they can use safely. and like thinking about and having like protocols in place so that we're ready in case anything happens that like we think is like potentially triggering or traumatizing for participants. And so I think what's really hard is that like you can plan and plan and plan, but unfortunately like things will happen unexpectedly. And so I think it's just a matter of like making sure that the things that don't go as planned aren't like so bad that like you are really, really like harming these communities. But I think, yeah, I don't know, you just have to do a lot of planning and stuff. Again, I don't feel like I'm perfectly answering your question, sorry. But
No, I got it. Got your point. Thanks.
yeah.
Okay, Calvin, thank you so much for kind of sharing with us your work and sharing with us kind of the kind of meta lens of kind of thinking about work with marginalized people more generally. We're going to wrap up here with kind of the recorded formal part. So I just want to say thank you again to Calvin with sharing with us, but please stay with us for the kind of social interaction part. And I'll mention that next week we'll have Chris Jansen hosting Dev Day, and they'll be talking about road user interaction with autonomous cars. And then the following week we'll have Jennifer Goldbeck, and she'll be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly in social media. So there's a lot to talk about. So join us in the next couple of weeks. We're going to stop the recording now, but please stay for the informal part.